Thank you for watching the Housing Oregon YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe. Slide decks from the presenters are going to be available below. Thanks for watching.
So first I'll talk to you about Housing Land Advocates, just a little bit about us. So since 2004, Housing Land Advocates, I'll call us HLA for short, has been dedicated to using land use planning, education, and law to ensure housing for all Oregonians. To ensure housing for all Oregonians of all income levels. HLA is an entirely volunteer-run and operated nonprofit composed of land use planners, attorneys, lenders, insurance providers, researchers, students, and housing advocates and practitioners with a demonstrated commitment to affordable housing. Our members sit on various councils and boards across the state, which enables HLA to participate in shaping policy. HLA serves as an advocate for thoughtful land use planning that aligns with housing policy, and as a watchdog to ensure that state and local governments fulfill their obligations under adopted housing policies, goals, and statutes. Our panelists, who all serve on HLA's board, we'll be discussing our advocacy and enforcement work, which includes the Post-Acknowledgement Plan Amendment Project, or the PAPAs project, which Sam will talk to you about in a little bit here, public comment, and then when necessary, litigation before Oregon courts. HLA is proud and honored to be an ally, uplifting the voices of all Oregonians, and especially communities which have been historically and are presently marginalized. HLA recognizes and calls out that land use planning has historically been wielded as a tool for affecting racial and economic segregation. We believe that land use planning can also be the opposite, a tool for dismantling structures of oppression and achieving spatial equity. This is particularly so within Oregon's land use system, which holds as its first goal public involvement in all levels of the planning process. So there are 4 parts to our presentation today, and 3 panelists. So firstly, Jean Dahlquist will be talking to you about the history of planning and zoning as tools of exclusion, Oregon's relevant land use law, and sort of the fair housing framework. Jean has been an HLA board member for 5 years and is the interim chair of the Organizational Development Committee. She is also a former urban planning policy consultant turned affordable housing finance professional. And then next, Jennifer Brager will be talking to you about the challenges and rewards of combating exclusionary planning and zoning practices through litigation. She'll be talking about this through the lens of a case called Housing Land Advocates versus Metro. Jennifer is a partner at Tomasi Brager Dubé with a dirt practice, land use, real estate, and environmental law. She has been practicing for over 15 years and has been on the HLA board for nearly as long, and she is currently the board president. And then Samuel Goldberg will be talking about unmasking exclusion and shaping policy through review, comment, and education through the lens of the PAPAs project, which I mentioned earlier. Samuel has been a board member at HLA since 2022, and his day job as the public policy manager at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, FHCO. He advances the incorporation of affirmatively furthering fair housing, AFFH, into state and local planning. He also coordinates the activities of AFFH and Systemic Investigations Committee, a collection of land use professionals and FHCO staff, which serves as a watchdog for local planning activities and provides technical support for jurisdictions. And then finally, we'll come all back together as a group and we'll talk about some proposed solutions to ongoing issues. And finally, I'd like to say that we believe part of the solution is coalition building. And that is why HLA strives to bring together policymakers, planners, affordable housing practitioners, and other community members to discuss how land use planning can support Oregon's affordable housing needs. We are actively seeking partnership and collaboration with other organizations working to promote affordable housing and housing choice, or with other aligned missions. And we gladly accept volunteers for our Housing Land Advocates annual conference to be held on March 14th, 2025. We would also be delighted to have your feedback about our panel or anything else. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And don't forget to come say hi to us at our vendor table where we have additional information and donuts. All right, and with that, we'll start with Jean. There you go.
Hello? Great. This is working. So, like, hey, okay. So, like June said, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of kind of what we're going to talk about before we talk about it. So, the first is kind of an abbreviated history, and I want to put this disclaimer out there. I am not a historian. The only qualification I have for this is I'm former military, so I'm really blunt and I can talk really fast. So, that's what I'm going to do. And also, as a disclaimer, there's a lot of history here. I'm sure I'm leaving things out. Again, I'm going to talk really fast because it's a very short panel. So please kind of bear with me if I mispronounce things or I miss an aspect that someone thinks is very important. Please come and talk to me about it afterwards. After that, we're going to talk about kind of how hard it is to change this system, but how we can. One of those is through law, advocacy, and action. So housing land advocates versus Metro. And then we're going to talk about the post-acknowledgement plan amendment project, kind of spotting like segregationist planning today and what we can do about it. So let's talk about an abbreviated history of how we got here and where are we anyway? Have things actually changed? So this is kind of typically a story, like we've all known these things, so you can Google this. Oregon hasn't had the greatest start. The strange thing, though, is that a lot of people talk about this history as if it's over. You know, you'll hear something like redlining, like this was done in the past. We have the Community Reinvestment Act. It's done. We're all happy go lucky now. I'll go through a few things and you can hear what my colleagues have to say, and I can let you decide about that for yourself. Oh, no. Okay. So the first thing we're talking about outside of my lack of technological skills is native displacement and a little land acknowledgement here, which I'm going to abbreviate, is that we really want to express our respect to the first peoples of this land, the 9 federally recognized tribes of Oregon. These people were here first, and they have an honor and an ongoing legal and spiritual relationship between the lands, plants, animals, and people indigenous to this place we now call Oregon. We need to take our time to kind of think about that because really, we got off to a terrible start with the Donation Land Act claim of 1850, which gave, before there were even any treaties, certain amounts of land to predominantly white males coming into the area. So, like, that's just where we got started here in Oregon. Oregon's constitution is another kind of example of getting off on the wrong foot. In 1859, we entered the Union as one of the only states with a Black exclusion law. That law was in place until 1926. We still had a lot of language, though, in our Constitution, and we decided to try to write that in 2021, Measure 14. The funny thing about that is it didn't pass. Measure 14 went to Oregon to kind of right the wrongs that were still in Oregon's Constitution, even though they weren't enforceable anymore, and it didn't pass. It did get actually passed in 2002, so that's great, but I think it's really good to recognize that this was brought to the people in Oregon, you know, in the 2000s, and people in Oregon said, no, we don't want to remove this language. Let's talk about racial covenants and racial violence. So this is actually a picture of Eugene. So not everything is about Portland. This wasn't just a Portland story. This is an Oregon story. So this is Eugene, 1943. This is zones where Japanese Americans were restricted or prohibited from living. Looks kind of similar to a red line map, correct? So this is kind of one of the things that where zoning got its start, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later. So the Fair Housing Act made things like that and also made covenants unenforceable when they were racially motivated. It was part of the sweeping Civil Rights Act of 1968. And the housing portion protects buyers and renters from discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, and the presence of children. That didn't mean, though, that there weren't other ways people could enforce the exclusivity of their neighborhoods. Violence was pretty commonly used, especially in Oregon. Portland's Chinatown was regularly raided. One of the biggest incidences was in the mid 1880s. It was raided by 8 masked men, and they tried to burn as many buildings as they could. They had an actual society called the Anti-Chinese Club. They routinely sponsored rallies with speeches, fundraising, brass bands, and dancing. So that was kind of a nice, fun thing to do on a Friday night in Portland, was to go to the Anti-Chinese Club. Let's talk about slum clearance and highways. So everybody here has probably heard of Albina. If you haven't, please look it up. It's a not fun, but an important history to read. So the idea behind urban renewal and slum clearance, when it was raised to the public in a polite way, was that you had places that were bringing the city down. They were dirty, there were some diseases, basically clear it out and start all over. But what you found out is that communities were systematically disinvested from. And then when it became time that they wanted to clear out a certain population to make way for a different population, is that they would use some clearance to justify removing people's homes and businesses, often at prices that didn't reflect the true value. Highways were also used for this. So, for example, we're going to talk about a little bit about Albina because it is the classic example here. So right now we have an overlaid image of the 1948 of what it would look like, and then we have what it looks like in 1962. So as you can see, Albina was a thriving neighborhood. It had a lot of dense homes. It was a really pillar of the Black community here in Portland. And through a lot of highway creation and slum clearance, you really ended up decimating a lot of that housing and creating kind of what we see today. So let's talk about redlining. Again, this is something that you've probably heard about and seen about. So this is where the federal government came in to see what mortgages were going to be insured or not, what areas could be invested in, and they recommended areas that were green lighted for investment, that were kind of proceed with caution, and that you shouldn't invest in. This was places that received federal money. And so you had areas of Portland, predominantly areas that where persons of colors lived, that were denied the ability to invest in their homes or to get mortgages there. And that kind of led to some of the slum clearances that we see today, because without the ability to invest, neighborhoods can degrade. It sets the stage for things like slum clearance. This is one of the most commonly referred to things when we talk about this is over, right? Redlining happened, we figured it out, we determined it wasn't legal, and it doesn't happen anymore. But what you'll actually see is a lot of these old maps that show where redlining was in the past are kind of where communities of color are still today, and where you'll see government dollars not go into and sort of helping improve and maintain these neighborhoods as great places to live. Zoning. So this is one of my favorite ones to talk about, because zoning is something that we've seen from the very beginning, and we've often think about it as a tool for good. And it's something that is definitely not over. So let's get into why zoning came to be and what it is. What is zoning? So this is a method where a municipality or other tier of government divides the land into zones, and each zone has a particular regulation. So you're going to have whether you can build single family, multifamily. You may have certain things about how a building can look. You may have things like wetland overlays that help with environmental regulations, things like that. So on its face, zoning is a really good tool to making sure that neighborhoods are safe, clean, and good places to live. However, it is kind of an anti-American concept if you think about it. It's something where the city has a great power over individual property owners. Americans as a whole tend to want to be able to do what they want to do on their property. So how come Americans gave the power to governments and other organizations to control what they do on their private property? Well, as is often in American politics, you see a lot of fear. So many of these quotes are from sort of the foundational cases that showed that zoning was a legitimate power that cities and governments could have. Euclid v. Ambler is one of the very first cases that solidified zoning in American lexicon. It referred to apartments as parasites on the single family zones. One of the things that we also saw was, can you divide and separate businesses like stores from residential areas? One of the reasons that this was justified, and this is in the case Savello versus New Orleans, is because they said that businesses would be a reason for people who were not of that neighborhood, predominantly criminals, to have an excuse to enter into that neighborhood, whereby if there was no business there, anybody who wasn't from that neighborhood would be singled out, and apparently the ban of suspicion would keep them from doing anything. So I'll let you think about what that actually means. But so parasites, criminals, another great industrial zoning initiative in New York City. The immigrants who were the employees in the garment industry were routinely referred to as flies. People didn't want the workers to be near where the garments were actually sold. And so they successfully lobbied for those businesses to be removed so that those workers would not be living there or be seen in those neighborhoods. And then my favorite is heathens. If you want to read a really interesting study or any interesting papers, look up Berkeley. Berkeley and California have been some of the pioneers of exclusionary zoning, and they weren't shy about talking about this. So BJ Blyther was part of the Berkeley Commission on Zoning. He really helped shape one of their first zoning initiatives. And his quote was, "We Californians are ahead of the most states in adopting zoning, thanks to the persistent proclivity of the heathen Chinese to clean out our garments in our midst." So they really wanted that garment cleaning to still occur. They just wanted it to occur elsewhere. And this is also one of my favorite quotes, is that this zoning was so effective and became very, very quickly omnipresent in America that I myself included growing up, I thought this was natural selection. I thought that single family homes were just what people wanted to live in and what was built. I thought that the division of industry was natural. And I also thought that, you know, maybe people lived around who they wanted to live with. And so, I mean, I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's routinely rated one of the highest segregated cities in America. And I just thought that was normal. And one of the things that we're finding out the more and more we dig into the history, and again, people weren't shy about talking about why they put these laws into place. The more you dig into it, the more you realize it's intentional, it's part of a system. And, you know, the question that we're going to kind of dive into is it still working the way it was originally intended to today? So here's the question. Is land use planning fixed? We do have a couple systems and ways that we can try to fight exclusionary principles. One of the first is the statewide planning goals and urban growth boundaries. There's 19 goals. We were very advanced in Oregon putting these into place in the 1970s, 1976. And so this is the idea that when cities and governments are planning for growth, are looking at the zonings that they're doing, you have to meet certain goals. One of those is housing. So it's saying that you have to look at your housing lands inventory and your buildable lands analysis, and you have to figure out whether your jurisdiction is providing for the housing that your citizens need and that your residents need. And that includes affordability level. That's an actual requirement for comprehensive plans and when everyone puts an amendment to the comprehensive plan. You also have Goal 14, which Jennifer will get into, which requires local and regional planning authorities to demonstrate that the identified urban land need, including land needed for housing, which is the basis for UGB expansions, cannot be reasonably accommodated on land already within the existing growth boundary. So this isn't just about creating housing, but it's providing an orderly system of growth and protecting our farmland. So weighing these kind of competing needs of industry, housing, and, you know, farmland, and kind of cities are supposed to be thinking about these things and come to equitable and sustainable solutions. We also had HB 2003, which brought together the housing production strategies, made that a requirement for certain cities. And it also created the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, the ONAM. And what that does is it's not just a certain city, because if you think about it, you can have a city that's predominantly exclusive, serves a higher income population, and they're going to say, well, based on our housing needs analysis, we don't need lower income housing. But why is that city exclusive? Well, it's probably exclusive because their housing supply is also, you know, 400, 500K and above. So a regional analysis actually says what's the regional need and then assigns a amount of housing per each city that is required. So it kind of helps balance out that city to city dynamic. So here's the details from HB 2003. For cities within the Portland metro boundary, they need to update their housing capacity analysis every 6 years. And cities outside the metro boundary must have an 8-year update cycle for their housing capacity analysis. And that's kind of determining like how much housing you need. And then it also requires each city above 10,000 to adopt a housing production strategy. And the strategy has to include specific actions the city plans to take, like changing regulations such as zoning or offering financial incentives to encourage the development of necessary housing types identified in the analysis. That sounds pretty great, right? So how do we know if this is working? One of the greatest things that we can look at, and this language you'll hear throughout this presentation, is disparate impact. And what does that mean? That means that you can have a law that's neutral on its face, but if you actually look at how it's playing out, it can disproportionately affect one class of people over another one. There are certainly certain federally protected classes and Oregon's protected classes. Since we're in Oregon, Oregon's protected classes include race, color, national origin, religion, disability, sex, including pregnancy, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, and marital status. So if you look at any of these land use planning regulations and you're seeing that they're disproportionately affecting one of these populations, then that is something that is not supposed to be occurring in Oregon. Another tool we have in enforcement is the Federal Fair Housing Act, which was adopted again as part of that sweeping Civil Rights Act of 1968. It makes equal access to housing regardless of one's race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, or disability, kind of the law of the land. And one of the things that I didn't know about the Federal Fair Housing Act is that you're required to have fair housing plans if you're a recipient of HUD money. So you have to take a meaningful action that overcomes patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities. And we have a number of cities that are required to do this. So you have Albany, Ashland, Bend, Corvallis, Eugene, Grants Pass, Medford. So all of these cities are supposed to be taking meaningful action to overcome patterns of segregation. And if you've been to those cities, I'll let you kind of decide whether they're actually accomplishing that or not. One of the exciting things in Oregon is we have a new affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which is now part of state housing policy, which is saying that housing production strategy, so those that I've referred to before, must affirmatively further fair housing. And so that doesn't mean that it just has to exist. They must be taking meaningful action to affirmatively further fair housing goals. And so those are some of the tools we have to kind of try to counteract right now segregationist land use policies. And that's kind of a benchmark that you can look at to measure whether it's working or not. Is, do we see through our experience of living in Oregon, through talking to people, do you see in GIS maps or anything like that, is there still a disparate impact for communities of color, for the BIPOC community, as a result of how we're doing land use planning? With that, I'll pass it off to Jennifer.
Thanks, Jean, for that great overview. Again, I'm Jennifer Brager, and I just want to say that I look out in this crowd and I'm really excited because I don't recognize very many of you. And so that means that we have found a new audience of people who may not be land use wonks like we are. So bear with us on all of this terminology. You know, it's one of the tools that is used to keep people out, you know, and I had to go to law school. June had to go to law school. Others are graduate in urban planning or getting their master's in urban planning just to learn what the acronyms mean. So we're happy to see you all here and to engage with us in kind of a heavy, you know, wonky topic about land use. And so Jean has given us a good overview of the history and the impetus for our work under the Fair Housing Act. So let's dive into HLA's unique efforts to raise awareness and impact policy change for housing in Oregon. And I'll just say that, you know, June kind of has the negative history of zoning, but the reason I'm passionate about it is because these rules really govern how we live amongst each other. And, you know, whether you're stuck in traffic, whether you like an urban growth boundary line to separate farming from suburban and urban uses, all these things that kind of make Oregon a special place also can have problematic impacts. So it sort of feeds into this idea that land use is politics and politics is what creates land use. So be engaged, that would be the take home message. So one of the most controversial topics in land use in Oregon is the urban growth boundary. And when there are expansions of what I'll say is the UGB, they are governed by state law, local and regional plans, and local government regulations. Statewide Planning Goal 14 provides the overarching planning process, and most UGB expansions are based on the lack of available land to accommodate the need for development within the existing boundaries of the city. And usually the need is based on housing or employment or industrial land demands. The UGB is an important tool to protect our natural and resource areas and is unique to Oregon. And they are the reason that you drive out of town and see that clear distinction between farmland or open space and urban and suburban development. And when you fly, you can see when you go state to state, what states kind of had this idea of an urban growth boundary. So beginning in 2018 and 2019, HLA started to advocate to the metro regional government about its plan to consider UGB expansions. That expansion process was meant as an off-cycle expansion to allow for certain cities to retrace their boundaries if they agreed to put in place some planning policies that would encourage affordable housing development. Notably, the process did not mandate construction of certain amounts of affordable housing, but just the encouragement of such land use policies that would ease constraints on affordable housing development. HLA submitted comments on a variety of shortfalls with the applicant cities. As HLA pointed out, the cities of Sherwood and Happy Valley are the cities with the highest median incomes in their counties. Unsurprisingly, the Clackamas County Consolidated Plan showed that Happy Valley's population growth between 2000 and 2010 was 208%. And in 2010, 76% of the population was white. Poverty had increased in the county by 10.4% between 2000 and 2010, and nearly half of female householders with young children under 5, a protected class, lived in poverty. Yet Metro's analysis did not include an analysis of whether Happy Valley has exclusionary zoning practices and/or results. Similarly, the city of Sherwood had the highest median income in Washington County and identified need to expand its urban growth boundary, and yet did not apply and was not required to apply for this expansion round. The City Council of Sherwood did not want to be tethered to affordable housing requirements that Metro had identified as a linchpin to successful applications. Again, none of which were mandatory to actually require built affordable housing. Metro was silent as to Sherwood's decision not to participate. So as you can see from the image pulled from the 2018 Urban Growth Report prepared for Metro, is what most of us already knew. People of color were being pushed further and further to the edge of the boundary, requiring longer commutes to work, less access to public services found closer to city centers, including transportation, parks, sidewalks, and other amenities. What became central to HLA's argument was Metro's refusal to upzone existing single-family residential neighborhoods based on a provision of its charter. Metro categorically refused to consider any, quote, increase in the density of single-family neighborhoods within the existing urban growth boundary identified in the plan solely as inner or outer neighborhoods, end quote. So what does that mean? If you're in the Portland metro area, think Eastmoreland and the area around Reed College. We are not going to invade that single-family residential neighborhood. That's what Metro was saying. Metro determined it must expand the boundary because it couldn't require additional efficiencies in single-family areas within the plans and land use regulations of cities and counties in the region, and consequently didn't look for these efficiencies. HLA argued that Metro conducted no analysis of areas other than the 4 cities that requested additional urban lands through this expansion. Namely, Metro did not require the city of Portland to densify existing single-family residential zones, even as the city cannot expand its boundary because it's surrounded by other cities. So it can't expand the urban growth boundary. So notably, fellow board member Ed Sullivan and I traveled to Condon, Oregon to testify in person to the Land Conservation and Development Commission about the impacts of Metro's decision and its failure to address the Fair Housing Act and failure to address racial and economic segregation. And I never knew where Condon was, and it is in the middle of nowhere. And again, this is before all land use hearings are required to have a Zoom option or a remote option. So driving out to Condon to voice your opinion on this urban growth boundary is real convenient. We did not get a single vote our way out of that commission. Complete complicity. We briefed these issues to the Court of Appeals. Our briefing was strong to the point of calling this land use decision modern day redlining. We argued the following in our conclusion, and I'll give credit to Mike Reeder, who was going to speak today but was unavailable. He's the attorney who volunteered pro bono to represent us. A number of board members helped with that effort as we're attorneys or retired attorneys, but he took the laboring oar. And so we're really appreciative of that. And we argued that Oregon state land use statutes and goals do not allow Metro or any other local or regional planning authority to establish or perpetuate internal urban residential growth boundaries. Such regulatory redlining prevents efficient use of large reservoirs of urban residential lands. It perpetuates de facto internal growth boundaries around what is no doubt the largest untapped source of existing capacity for single-family residential infill. It undermines principles of compact and efficient urban development implemented by the urbanization, energy, and public facilities goals. So these other statewide planning goals. We asked for reversal or remand, and what we wanted Metro to be directed to do was that Metro should be required to take all reasonable measures to accommodate the 3% remnant of the identified need in compliance with the urbanization goal and with statewide housing goal. Key to the reasonableness and adequacy of that analysis will be detailed information and analysis concerning the quantities, locations, distributions, and current maximum densities in each existing neighborhood, as well as existing and potential disparate impacts on populations protected by state and federal fair housing laws. The Court of Appeals sided with the Land Conservation and Development Commission, the commission that governs the Department of Land Conservation and Development, so the statewide planning agency. Some may view this as a loss, but our litigation strategy was meant as a wake-up call to local and state government alike that these issues were not going away and that the time for a solution was at hand. The timing of this litigation, combined with public sentiment and dissatisfaction with the impacts of systemic racism, helped pave the way to new bills in 2019. Jean mentioned House Bills 2001 and 2003 that both aim to impose statewide rules on local zoning and better planning for housing needs across regions, including fair share of affordable housing. And I'll say, you know, this is a very exciting time for land use planning. I'll give you a little more detail than what June provided, but before these bills, Metro had its own fair share requirement and it just never did anything. And so our call to action today is make sure they do something. Make sure they don't just write another report and put it on the shelf and let it gather dust. You know, this is our time to actually have some meaningful change. So as Jean said, House Bill 2001 requires cities with populations greater than 10,000 or within Metro to allow duplexes in land zoned for single family dwellings within urban growth boundaries. It requires Metro counties and cities with populations greater than 25,000 to allow middle housing and land zoned for residential uses within urban growth boundaries. So even more than duplexes, things like cottage dwellings, townhouses, attached housing, other kinds of more dense housing. It required DLCD to draft a model ordinance. It requires cities and counties to amend their comprehensive plan and land use regulations to conform with the requirements or to directly apply model ordinances that were developed. It requires local governments to support density expectations with findings when updating regulations to accommodate housing need. It prohibits enforcement of new restrictions that would prohibit the construction of middle housing and governing documents for planned communities or instruments affecting title to real property. So that's an important one because a lot of HOAs or homeowners associations prevent the construction of an accessory dwelling unit or a duplex on property. So going forward, you're not going to be able to see those in homeowners association documents. And it prohibits conditioning approval of accessory dwelling units within the UGB on off-street parking availability or owner occupancy. So those are all good rules to bring about some hopefully market rate affordability in otherwise exclusively single family zones. But the bill that I was most excited about is House Bill 2003, and that is the regional housing needs analysis. It finally aims to break down some of the silos in state government. It requires the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department in coordination with the Department of Land and Conservation Development and the DAS, the Administrative Services Agency, to develop that regional housing needs analysis. It requires these housing production strategies, and DLCD is the approval body for the strategy. And while members of the public may comment to DLCD about the strategy, the housing production strategy itself is not a land use decision, and that's pretty significant. So there is no straight appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals. However, failure to implement this strategy gives a private party a right to seek enforcement through the Land Conservation and Development Commission. So that's not an easy path. It's not straightforward. It requires a lawyer to help you through it, you know? So again, it's all like is this an accessible land use process? And is there a way to have meaningful change? We'll see how it goes, but it did create a barrier to private actions on these plans. There is a housing needs analysis schedule, and there is a requirement to reduce the barriers of needed housing development, and it allows public property to be developed with affordable housing so long as it's located within an urban growth boundary and is not protected as open space or a park under a statewide planning goal. So, okay, super quick because we have some time for questions, but within an urban growth boundary on property zoned single family residential. But I'm not giving legal advice, so you have to look at your local code and address the issue. All right, so our board is actively involved in shaping these rules, spending hundreds of volunteer hours on committee meetings, review of dense documents, and advocating for policy correction. And I'll give Sam especially huge credit for doing this regularly on behalf of our board, and Kathy Wild, Ed Sullivan, Sarah Adams Shane. These are not easy things. They're hours-long meetings. The documents are, this thick before they get this thick. So it's hard work. Another round of bills passed in 2023 to govern rulemaking for the regional housing planning, now called the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, or the ONA. But there will always be bad actors. As we speak, the city of Sherwood is now proposing to expand its urban growth boundary. The aim is to continue to build exclusive single-family zone properties that aim to keep low-income people out of the city limits. I have a long history of examining Sherwood's antics and can talk with those of you who might be interested later. But it's pretty apparent by the large swath of brown that low-density residential zoning is just the way the city likes it and wants it to stay. So Sam is going to talk about a few other examples of what HLA has done in terms of advocacy, and then we'll find a way to give you some hope for the future.
Hi, everyone. Thanks to the people who stayed in this room. I know you're probably sick of me at this point. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Post-Acknowledgement Plan Amendment, the PAPA project, which is quite a fun acronym. It's going to sound really wonky and sound really complicated. What I hope that you take away from my section is that if it's done right, it's actually super simple. This is an amazing tool within the Oregon system that makes land use decisions accessible to all of us. So first, a little bit about the history of our project. It is a partnership between Fair Housing Council of Oregon, which is my day job, and Housing Land Advocates, which is my night job, beginning in 2015. So we've been at it for a while. We review all housing-related post-acknowledgement plan amendments which are submitted to the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development Commission, or DLCD. So I'm going to be using PAPA and DLCD a lot. It is grant funded by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, Housing and Community Services, OHCS, and Business Oregon, OBDD. And then as we wrap up each quarter and report our findings to a committee of land use professionals. Our last quarter was actually just ended yesterday. So, I have brand new stats on this. And so the idea is that these land use professionals, state agency officials, can look at what we're seeing come up through these PAPAs and then be able to identify some systemic issues and actually propose solutions. So here is the PAPA process. So a city or county submits their comprehensive plan and then all subsequent amendments to that plan to DLCD. And then DLCD looks at it. If they say they did their job, then they acknowledge it. So that's where the acronym Post Acknowledgement Plan Amendment comes from, is because DLCD has already acknowledged their comprehensive plan. And so it's coming after that, all changes that come after that. So the PAPA project, our work, downloads that information weekly from the DLCD PAPA database. The staff report is uploaded to a project management site, which we review. You know, some FHCO staff are on there, HLA, and then a couple of other volunteers. We look at it. We look at what their goal 10 findings are. We look at, you know, sometimes if it's a little more in the weeds and we want to look at what the implications of particular amendment are, we'll get deeper into it. But the really important thing is these goal 10 findings. And so I'm going to explain what that is in a little bit. It's a really efficient way to evaluate these amendments to make sure that they're actually following state law. If the findings are lacking, if they, you know, sometimes they just don't put them in, sometimes it is insufficient for what we're looking for, then I will reach out to the planner, provide some technical assistance, say, hey, this is what we're looking for. And hopefully they make some changes. And I mean, I would say that we have a pretty good record of getting changes, getting better findings after that contact. At that point, you know, the amendment goes through the planning commission in the city or the county, and then eventually the city council, and we will submit comment letters to the planning commission and city council. And if we liked their findings, we thought they did a good job, we'll send a positive letter. If we did not like their findings, if they did not include findings, then we'll send a negative comment letter. And we will CC DLCD on all of those contacts. And that process is important because it gives us, Fair Housing Council and HLA, standing to appeal those land use decisions later on, because we have now participated in the process. We've submitted a comment letter. So again, all of this process is arranged in a way to be very efficient for staff time, because it's pretty much just us, but to also have maximum impact. Okay, so what are we looking for? I mentioned goal 10. So ORS 197175 mandates that comprehensive plans and zoning maps comply with the statewide land planning goals, including goal 10 housing. So the decisions that cities make cannot leave the city or county with less than what is needed to meet the 20-year housing need. And they can show this by referring to their, what is now called the housing capacity analysis. Previously, we referred to it as the housing needs analysis. That's going to show what their 20-year housing need is. A component of that is the buildable lands inventory. So that shows how much they currently have zoned for what densities and how much they're going to need in 20 years. And then the city and county must also quantify the change in the capacity. So if they're saying we're going to zone this from low density to medium density, they can say this land can accommodate this many units right now. This is the amount of units that are going to be accommodated after this amendment passes. And this is going to get us closer to meeting our needs found in the housing capacity analysis, right? So it's real basic arithmetic, like this is what we have now, this is what we're going to have, this gets us closer. Or, I mean, as we're going to see in a second, this gets us farther away from meeting our goals, because that does happen too. And this is actually a perfect example of that. So this is what we would consider gold star goal 10 findings. This is these planners did everything right. So this was a rezone from high density residential to light industrial. Ordinarily, this is something that would get a lot of skepticism from us, right? They're taking land out of the housing supply and rezoning it as industrial. But they showed that this was actually totally fine by showing, first off, what their housing needs analysis and what their buildable lands inventory said. It says that, at the end of their 20-year cycle, they're going to have a 123 acre surplus of their residential lands for low density, 10.62 of medium density, 39.67 of high density. So they showed that, they mentioned they're going to have a 39.67 acre surplus of that high density land. This change only takes out 0.33 acres from that high density land supply. And then they say what their total need is. And so they make the argument that after this change, they are not leaving their city with less land than it needs to meet its goals, right? So again, it's coded in ridiculous wonky terms that planners have come up with to make this a really opaque process. But at its base level, this shows that this is actually super understandable. So what are the results of this? When the project began, over 75% of the PAPAs we were seeing had zero goal 10 findings or insufficient goal 10 findings. That is now down to less than 15% per quarter. In this last quarter, we actually only submitted one negative comment letter, which is amazing. And that's like 3.9%, I think, of our of the PAPAs that we saw, we actually submitted negative comments on. This has also been a really important training tool on the Oregon statewide land use planning system for planners who, maybe were trained out of state or even trained in Oregon's universities because they don't teach the Oregon land use planning system. Some of the most difficult conversations I've had with planners have been people who have said, what are you talking about? I've been a planner for 25 years. I've never had to do these findings. And then after asking a few questions, he was a planner in Utah. We have some different laws here that they have to follow. And so this has been a really important training system for, making sure that local planners actually know what their obligations are under Oregon law. I think that this has been a proof of concept that the land use planning system can and should be accessible and approachable for everyone in Oregon, right? Too often, the people who are most affected by zoning are also the people who have the least amount of access to affecting it. It has made it so that DLCD staff are much more likely to get involved. We've got a really notable example that I'll mention in a second. But previously, DLCD was kind of seen as a rubber stamp agency for these amendments. They didn't really push back when a city just wasn't doing the basic work that they needed to do to show that this was going to be an acceptable amendment under state law. And it has also revealed a variety of systemic issues which have led to persistent segregation. So one of the main patterns that I have seen that has been really galling is using zoning to effectively sabotage multifamily housing. A lot of these are zoning maps from the 80s that just never got revisited. And what it has, revealed is that multifamily housing was zoned in a lot of cities to places where it was never going to get built, either because of the high slope area, right? It ends up having like a 3% slope. And so building multifamily housing is completely impractical in that space. This is something that we actually saw in Pendleton, in a few other locations. Floodplains, places where multifamily could not get insured if it was built in the floodplain. And yet in places like Cottage Grove, a huge percentage of their multifamily housing was in floodplain areas. So on paper, according to the buildable lands inventory, they've got enough multifamily. They don't have to rezone. They're doing fine. But in practice, none of that multifamily is getting built. The pattern is only revealed when that land is downzoned, right? And then we are like, what's going on? How can you justify downzoning land? And they say, well, it's because there's a really high slope here or there's a floodplain here. So that's kind of hidden exclusion. Here's a very recent example from this month, in fact, of pretty naked exclusion. So this is an amendment called Happy Valley LU 0014 2024. It has been through the Planning Commission. It has not yet been through City Council. It creates an overlay zone that effectively bans cottage clusters, which were legalized under House Bill 2001, in an area of Happy Valley called the Bowl, which is kind of like the most established neighborhood, also the place where the highest land values are, the highest home values are. And it does that. It says that this is legal. The city says that this is legal because in House Bill 2001, there was something called the performance metric, which is that cities, when they were creating their middle housing codes, could come up with justifiable reasons why certain types of housing could be allowed in certain places only. Happy Valley is the first city since House Bill 2001 was passed in 2019 to try this. And we have skepticism, right? So the cottage cluster limitation overlay zone is all of the pink area here. And then these yellow areas are where it has not only legalized, but the city claims that it's going to be easier to build cottage clusters in those areas. So the city claims that that the net number of lots where cottage clusters can be built are actually going to be increased as a result of this amendment, even though they're banning it in like a third of the city. They also claim that because they use this really irregular boundary to carve out this overlay zone, that it's not creating like strict barriers of segregation. Again, we've got questions about that. It also, in the city's staff report, and this was, I found completely astonishing, they said that because non-white populations in the city of Happy Valley actually have higher incomes than white populations, then it is not, this is not going to be creating any racial or ethnic segregation. Now, in our comment letter, I'll note that we said, first off, even if that's true, which we have significant skepticism about, there are other protected classes which you could be creating segregative barriers towards. For instance, people with disability. Cottage clusters represent a great opportunity for people with disabilities to get into housing in an integrated way, right in the neighborhood. Also, familial status, right? A lot of times, larger families in high cost areas like Happy Valley, they need those more affordable housing types like cottage clusters in order to get into safe and stable housing. So by banning cottage clusters, you're keeping those people out. They were pretty explicit that this was to preserve the neighborhood character in the bowl, which is a classic stand-in for discrimination, right? It's that is if you had to come up with one proxy term that comes up more than any other for justifying segregation, it's preserving neighborhood character. And they actually use that phrase in the staff report. Now, DLCD actually jumped in on this too. They said that the prohibition of cottage clusters conflicts with the legislative direction and principles provided to state and local governments, and the implementation of Goal 10 will reinforce patterns of racial and economic segregation by foreclosing opportunity for more affordable housing options within the city for both rental and ownership housing. DLCD does say that at the moment, they think that this is technically legal, but it does open up the city to a lot more scrutiny every single planning cycle going forward. All right, so that explains the Papa's project.
And we're moving on to a couple solutions. We're running out of time here, so I'm going to try to be quick again, so really fast. One of the main intentions of this presentation is we want to use the word segregation. In Oregon, we like to be politically correct. We like to tiptoe around facts that we know are true. And so we wanted to get this out here. One of the cool things about it is that we started saying we were going to do this panel, and then we saw DLCD, who sits in our little quarterly report meetings and heard about this panel, use the word segregation to respond to Happy Valley. So that was one of our intentions, and we want all of you to not be shy to call this out and say what it really is. This is also a really nice map of race in one of Oregon's cities today. So talking again to disparate impact. Accessibility. So as you heard Sam say, some of these processes, it sounds complicated, but it can be really simple. If cities are doing what they're supposed to be doing, if they're making a land use change, you should be able to go online, which has accessibility issues, yes, but you should be able to go online, bring up a document, you should be able to Control F, goal 10, and see what impact this is going to have on housing, not just on the capacity to build housing units in general, but what type of affordability levels are being encouraged or discouraged through that decision. We see a lot of times that planners try to dump a bunch of words and definitions into these findings to make them inaccessible, to make them hard to read, that people will be delayed in having these reports available so that they're available only after decisions are made so that you can read about it, but you can't affect change. And we really want to ensure that all of these findings for Goal 10 are available in advance of final decisions, that they're easily found and accessible so you don't need to contact a planner, you don't need to do a complicated search on a website. It's very straightforward to find, that they're easily understood and laid out. So no throwing a whole bunch, like we've seen like 2 pages of definitions and just garbledygook trying to make something sound really complicated. And there's maybe 3 or 4 sentences about the real decision. It's just a copy and paste in the entire set of findings. And so it really needs to be easily understood and laid out. So that very basic logic of what are your needs? What does the data show that you need in terms of number of units and affordability? Is this furthering those goals or not? If it is, how? How many units? How many, like what types of units are going to be available? Why are you doing this decision? Just lay it out in simple 3-paragraph essay, elementary school logic. So then it goes into articulating the rationale with data and in a consistent fashion so that someone who can understand a report in Happy Valley can do the same thing in Salem, in Eugene, and in Portland. So NOAA stands for Naturally Occurring Affordable Housing, and we want to say protect this and not single family. So one of the things we see a lot is in previous patterns of zoning, if you had middle, like medium density zones, they're usually along a commercial corridor or they're regulated in certain neighborhoods. Along a commercial corridor, that can be for parking and traffic, but it also has this view that apartments really are only worthwhile as literally a living barrier to protect the single family zones from smog and congestion, right? And that is the use of that. And that is also where a lot of the affordable of housing will have occurred if it's there. So example, you have a medium density zone, it's going to be a more affordable construction type, typically wood. And if it's been there a while, it's probably has aged. So this is where you see a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing. Now, you can see this in LA and a lot of places in California. California is a great predictor of what can happen in Oregon, where they're trying to fulfill housing capacity by simply taking these medium density zones and upzoning it to high density residential. Well, what's high density residential? It's expensive. It's expensive to build. It's new. You may have an inclusionary zoning law, you may not, but a lot of times inclusionary zoning, like right now in Portland, it's very close to fair market value. So who are you really serving? Is that the same population? And it's probably not the same people who have been living there for quite a while. So what happened in LA is they started encouraging density by upzoning all these medium density zones to high density, and they caused a lot of gentrification and a lot of displacement. Yes, they were creating more units in general, but they were not helping the populations that already lived there. This also continues patterns of exclusion, right? If you only have, instead of having a mixture of zones in, that's well balanced, if you just have these tiny dense areas, that's exclusionary, right? Apartments and the people who live there are worth more than living, breathing barriers to traffic and to smog, right? They should be integrated into neighborhoods where they have access to green space and opportunity and good school districts and things like that. So the solution there is to, traffic notwithstanding, And looking at this also from an urban growth boundary perspective is if most of your city is zoned single family, that's got to change, right? Upzone that to medium density and don't necessarily rely on, again, turning that medium density to high density. Consequences. So this is something where we might need some smart people in the audience, all of you, to come out with. But as Jennifer was talking about, a lot of these requirements require you to plan for but not build lower income and affordable housing. So what's to stop a lot of cities from undermining in some way that we can't find out, right? We're just a bunch of volunteers. Undermining the multifamily construction, the affordable housing construction in some way that we don't know. So they say, oh, we're encouraging it, but developers just don't want to come to Sherwood. They just don't want to be here. And so how are we supposed to know and what's supposed to happen? And so we're advocating for there to be actual consequences. Now, we don't know what that should be, but if whatever you're doing in your city isn't working, well, then maybe something should change.
Well, I have one idea and it's very draconian. And so this idea of the Fair Housing Act, the Federal Fair Housing Act, means that if you are federally funded, think transportation dollars, then you have an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. So there is a direct correlation to whether you should be allowed to improve your streets and roads and whether you're providing housing for affordability. Now, that is an extreme measure, but it is one that the state could wield if it really wanted to. So instead of letting this sort of getaway car of, yeah, we did a report and we can't do anything, Sherwood can't do anything, it's time to call the bluff, because otherwise the change will be too slow and people will continue to be excluded.
That was awesome. Thank you. And then I'll let Sam talk a little bit about that. But as we've seen, the Papa Project is really important in bringing some of these issues to light. We're just a bunch of volunteers, plugging away with what we can. And we want to continue to make an impact, but we also want to continue to involve other people in this project. So Sam, do you want to talk about this slide?
Sure. Yeah, so we've used the structure of the Papa Project to engage in some pretty big stuff outside of the normal Papas. So that includes those housing production strategies. We submitted comments on the City of Portland's housing production strategy a few weeks ago. We will submit comments on Lake Oswego's next week. Really excited to dig into that one. We also, the lessons that we have learned really can inform a lot of model codes and processes going forward. So again, making sure that these things are accessible and have the most inclusive results possible. And we've learned a lot from the success of the House Bill 2001 middle housing regulations, which set a state model code so that if a city didn't meet the deadline or didn't want to pass its own middle housing codes, too bad, you got a backstop of the state's middle housing model code. We love to do, trainings like this. We haven't done a lot of presentations like this outside of our own conference, the HLA conference. But we think that training advocates on how to read land use decisions and how to participate is a really important way to affect change. And we can also train organizations to be able to participate in planning. We talked about the value of coalition earlier. And this is definitely, a role that we can play in coalitions, is making sure that everyone's on the same page about, how to understand different land use decisions and how to affect those changes.
So the last solution, of course, is to participate in some capacity. We're all stronger together. This requires many, many people to make concrete change. So you can Google us, Housing Land Advocates. We'll pop right up. Same thing with Fair Housing Council of Oregon. We have an annual conference. It's a great opportunity to get to know us better. If you're an organization who wants to speak at the conference, you have something really important to say, or you want to come and attend, please talk to us. We want to really use these conferences to showcase a lot of different organizations and bring people together. The format of the conference is straightforward in that everybody sits through the same sessions. And so one of the things we've noticed is in a lot of conferences like that, you have the developers, you have the advocates, you have the bankers, they're all separate. So in this conference, everybody sits together and sees the same things, and we really kind of see a lot of community building through that. So we kind of went a little bit over time, but I'm willing to push the boundaries. If anyone has any questions, now is a good time to ask. And I think there's already one right there. And if we can't get to them all, just come talk to us after. We have donuts at our booth, if we didn't say that before.
How are the members of Metro and the LDCD appointed, or how do you get on those boards, and how do we influence that?
Okay, so just to restate the question, it's how do the members of Metro and LCDC get elected to the boards, and how do we as a community influence that?
So LCDC is an appointed board by the governor. If you have interest when there's openings, DLCD has a newsletter you can sign up for to get all their notices. But their terms are listed on the LCDC website, and the governor has a person, Maya Crawford, Peacock Crawford, sorry, who is the governor's liaison for appointments to all state agency commissions. And then Metro has an elected board. So if you live in the Metro area, you get to vote on them, and they run for election.
And they both have various advisory committees. And I believe in both cases, people are encouraged to apply for that on the website. Yeah, exactly.
Are there any other questions?
Thank you.
I just wanted to get your guys' thoughts on policies like Justice 40 or North-Northeast preference and those kinds of things that try to sort of use address-based ways to allocate public funds in a way to try to reach people who are currently and historically underserved.
So I can talk a little bit about the preference policy. As was said in my intro, I work in affordable housing finance. And what we often see is a disconnect between the ideals of a policy and how they're actually delivered upon. So in my personal experience, I've seen the Northwest Preference Policy cost developers up to $500,000 with delayed lease-ups. And it's kind of a red flag that then costs that developer money for their pricing on their tax credits. And so it kind of turns into something that's not particularly effective and is really resisted by nonprofits who are kind of on the edge and trying to serve these communities anyway. I think policies like that are really good, but I'd like to see more integration between people who make the policies and the actual developers. And I think there's also a lot of distrust there. And that's one of the things that I think we really need to kind of come together and fix, is especially if you're a small nonprofit developer who's very community minded and is trying to serve a population. Most of the time, those people aren't trying to pull your leg, right? They're really just trying to survive and do what they can to serve the populations that they're trying to serve. And if we can work together, we can come up with policies like that that actually help the community without basically creating a unintentional tax that then has to be filled by another form of gap financing that then comes from the community. And so it just creates a very inefficient cycle. So it's a very good intention, and we need to see things like that, but there just needs to be more integration. And I don't actually know about Justice 40. I don't know if we know that. I'd love to hear more about it, though.
Well, I can speak to more like just using location as a guide for investment is absolutely key to affirmatively furthering fair housing. Like it's kind of the whole thing, right? Is the idea is that you are putting public investment in areas that already have housing opportunity, and you're putting housing opportunity in areas that have gotten public investment in the past. A really good example of that in practice, although it's very new and it remains to be seen how it works, is that ORCA, the OHCS LIFT funding for affordable housing is now going to be done on this location scoring basis. Unfortunately, OHCS's ORCA presentation, I believe, was also during this block. So I definitely recommend checking out their presentation. I'm curious about it as well. But it creates scoring criteria that basically determines if affordable housing dollars are going to go into a place, and makes sure that they're going to be directed to high quality, high opportunity neighborhoods. And so that's a really important piece of the puzzle. But the other half of that is that we also need to be putting those public investment dollars into the places that already have the affordable housing. So it's, yeah, two approaches that definitely have to inform each other.
All right, and it looks like we are about 30 minutes from time. So unless there are like any burning questions, I think I'll call it. Thank you all so much for coming to join us and listening to us speak. Again, we would love to hear from all of you, whether at our table downstairs, again, there are donuts, or via email. Again, please feel free to join us at our conference in March, on March 14th of this coming year. We'd love to see you there. Thanks, everybody.